Welcome to the ITSP Magazine Podcast Network. You're listening to a new episode of the Leadership Student Podcast with MK Palmore. We are all lifelong learners, and nowhere is this more relevant than in the practice of leadership. Our goal is continual learning and improvement. Let's get after it. Knowledge is power, now more than ever.
Welcome, everybody. This is MK Palmore, and this is the current session of the Leadership Student Podcast. I'm joined today by Angelo Riddick, retired Colonel, United States Army, and former CIO for the state of New York. We're going to have an enticing and engaging conversation about the subject of leadership, and I want to welcome Angelo to the stage now. Angelo, thank you for joining us, and welcome.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
And Angelo, I know you go by Tony as well. What's more comfortable for you?
Yeah, Tony's very comfortable. Thank you very much.
Okay, excellent. Tony, you have a fantastic background. And as we talked about in the tee up for this podcast is really about pulling the thread on stories around the leadership journey of the guest.
I'm originally from Norfolk, Virginia, a small town on the eastern coast of Virginia, the largest naval base in the United States. Grew up essentially for the first 8 years in a military household with my stepfather, who was a naval chief petty officer. My parents divorced and we moved exactly to the ghetto. You know, I always elaborate on this term hood as opposed to ghetto. The hood glamorizes a terrible condition. In my days, it was a ghetto and it was a terrible condition. We moved to a different neighborhood, had an opportunity to attend segregated schools until the fourth grade. As a matter of fact, I went back from an integrated school system to a segregated school system, leaving Virginia Beach, Virginia, and going into Norfolk. Matriculated through the Norfolk public school systems, graduated in 1979. Along the way, I took junior ROTC, and I was a high school football player. Actually, I was a standout in my senior year, but no plans to play college football and really no academic foundation to pursue a college education. However, I had an opportunity to attend a small military college in Alabama, Marion Military Institute, located in Southwest Alabama. Matriculated through Albany State, graduated with a Bachelor of Business Administration and a minor in management. Had no aspirations to work in computers whatsoever. Came on active duty, 1983, 1984. As an infantry officer, attended the Army's Airborne and Ranger School in the Infantry Officer Basic Course as a first lieutenant, since I did receive an early commission, so it was really And to my amusement, the Army actually sent me to the Systems Automation School because I had a pretty robust background in IT. I taught myself programming, I taught myself networking, I taught myself application development, so I was pretty thorough. And the Army sent me as a lieutenant colonel to the Systems Automation course in Fort Gordon, Georgia from 2001 to 2000. I then was selected to attend the Advanced Management Program course at the National War College, National Defense University. Upon graduation, I was given an opportunity to teach as a professor at the National Defense University. I served 6 years teaching IT leadership and cybersecurity leadership at the base level. So it was a really good opportunity to learn the information technology infrastructure library and understand the application of integrating systems, not necessarily doing programming or hardwiring or anything like that, but understanding how to be a senior chief information officer within the United States Army. Ironically, I was promoted to full-bird colonel, and I went over to Iraq, where I served as a base commander. The title is actually Site Lead Base Commander for Kirkuk, Iraq, from 2011 to 2012. In the exodus phase, if you will, of combat troops leaving Iraq. So I got a chance to command the base under fire for 14 months while downsizing that operation and working with about 5,000 soldiers that dwindled down to 42. Our job transitioned from combat operations support to base security and flight training because we had an air base there. It was an 06 level command. I left Iraq in 2012, was assigned to the Army Cyber Command, where I worked 2 years as a concept development director, and retired again to Florida in 2019, and immediately received a call from the governor of New York with an opportunity to serve as the chief information officer for the largest connected enterprise in the United States. We ran 53 agencies from Albany's location, the Capitol headquarters. I worked for 2 governors there, had a really great time. One of the major accomplishments there was establishing the Joint Security Operations Center in Brooklyn, New York, an operation of $61 million, operating under my initial $1 billion budget for the state, responsible for security management for the enterprise. As a CIO, I managed the enterprise for 53 agencies, had 3,400 employees, like I said, $1 billion budget, and just had fun. Decided to retire and return to Florida, and I hope to stay retired for quite some time. So it's been a pretty adventurous journey along the way. I hope I haven't shared too much. And does that meet the requirements, MK? Did I give you a pretty quick run?
You unloaded. I think that, first of all, thank you for your service. As you well know, we're both veterans, and I always want to make sure that I want to always acknowledge the service of fellow veterans. You laid out a pretty extensive career track, all of which I think is going to be super interesting, and some of which I think we'll be able to pull the threads back and have some really good conversations. If you don't mind, I want to go all the way back to potentially your youth and talk about when the concept or discipline of leadership first became real to you. You talked you mentioned a couple things about participating in high school athletics. I suspect it maybe even was something that was seeded with you before then. But what's your earliest memory of the concept of leadership making sense to you?
Decision making. My grandmother was a very strong leader in the house. I grew up with her when we moved out of Virginia Beach into Norfolk. Decision making, understanding that I had a job to be responsible at all times, and that if it was to be, it was up to me. Now, that's a trite statement, actually a paraphrase from Jesse Jackson's speech in 1979 that I listened to. He said, if it is to be, it's up to me. I took that responsibility to heart, understanding that I was the captain of my fate and the master of my soul. Therefore, I took a lot of leadership positions, particularly in junior ROTC in 1979. I worked under the guise of a chief warrant officer, Paul H. Evans, who was very strict on leadership with his junior level cadets at Granby High School in Norfolk, Virginia. He instilled in me the desire to be a leader, to understand the leadership aspect of the military. In junior ROTC, they teach you how to be a great citizen, but he emphasized leadership. And I'm proud to say that I'm his first commissioned officer, his only 06. He passed away several years ago, but I can tell you, he has been a leader, a friend, a mentor, and a guide throughout my career, along with my grandmother, instilling responsibility, making sure that I understood the tenets, the basic tenets of leadership, and then getting some of those principles ingrained in me in formal structure through Mr. Evans, the chief warrant officer in charge of the junior ROTC program, was my underpinning of leadership as I developed my style.
So I'm glad you mentioned first your grandmother, then the ROTC instructor who clearly had an impact on you, but some of this clearly also resonated with you as an individual. I think you saw maybe some order and discipline associated with the subject of leadership. How were your early goings at leading? Tell me maybe an experience in high school sports, even in JROTC. I assume you had leadership positions there. Did you really understand what it was, or were you just kind of replicating or reiterating things that you thought were leadership?
No, I had a pretty strong foundation, and I always look at leadership as responsibility, being responsible for more than myself, being able to guide and make conscious decisions to help people go in the right direction. Fortunately, I played quarterback in my senior year. I was a starting quarterback and one of the leading passers in the state.
Natural leader?
I would say it's natural leadership. And I know we're going to touch on that a little later, but I believe leadership is innate. It's a capability that's born in you that can be improved and polished over the years through experience. I led the junior ROTC drill team for the first time in the history of the program. As a drill team commander, we won the state title in 52 trophies, first place trophies around the state in various drill competitions. Developing an innovative routine was my trademark. Understanding limitations of the Springfield 1903 weapon, and managing it and managing the people. Developing a style that included training, maintaining, leadership, discipline, safety, and force protection along the way. That was my tactical view of leadership. As my journey continued, of course, I had a more robust 50,000 foot view as a senior leader, and I became a strategic leader at that point. So football quarterback, junior ROTC leader, led in the junior college that I attended, Marion Military Institute. So I had a pretty solid foundation in leadership along the way.
So you already touched on something that, as you indicated, we were going to bring up later, but let's unpack it now. Are leaders born or are they made?
You know, I've always been an antagonist of the concept of leaders being made. You know, you can teach a young person all of the traits of a good leader, but if that person does not have the innate ability to be empathetic, understanding, disciplined, forthright, and a person who takes the initiative without instruction, you cannot have a good leader. Now, I believe that leaders are born, but they can be polished. For instance, you know, it was young in my days when I found out that I needed to be the last person to eat and to ensure that my soldiers ate in the chow line, just in case the food ran out. When I became a company commander, I was further polished in understanding that I had to be a servant and an empathetic leader, in that my first major accident that one of my soldiers was involved in Europe, I was more concerned about the vehicle. And my first sergeant, my right-hand individual in my company of 200 soldiers, he said, "Sir, you need to ask about the health and welfare of the soldier." Understanding that I had a responsibility to maintain my equipment and get the mission accomplished, I totally overlooked mission requirements, or I overlooked the soldier's health and welfare in that accident and focused on the condition of the truck, the condition of the mission, the condition of the military impedimenta. And the day he said, always focus on the soldiers. If they're healthy, don't worry about the truck. That's that polishing that can be done to a natural leader. But to say that a leader can be taught from the baseline who has no leadership experience, they can understand the tenets of leadership: discipline, training, stick-to-itiveness, initiative. All those things you can beat in someone's head, but they have to have the innate ability to exercise that skill set in a moment's notice. So leaders are born.
I love that you take a firm stand on it. I don't want to debate you. I'm not sure I agree with the end statement, but you certainly touched on what I believe to be essential, which is that polishing that happens among all leaders at some point during their lives. And it's awesome that you were able to actually trace the subject of empathy back to a very particular situation that you recall and you remember. So let's unpack that a little bit. Talk a little bit about the role empathy plays in leadership and what role it's played throughout your career since the time of that particular incident with the soldier in the vehicle.
Absolutely. There's some hard stands that you can define in leadership. Again, discipline, initiative, and all of those other things. But it's the squishy stuff in the middle that one should be concerned with. Being able to trust, being able to show loyalty and understand how to identify loyalty, being able to be compassionate, again, empathetic, being able to persevere. Those things that you have to employ to be a good leader. You have to stick with it, as Roger Kipling said, long after others have faded into nothingness and dust. You have to be that person that's willing to come in early and stay late, but then understand that you shouldn't require your subordinate leaders to do the same. You should require them to be, first of all, efficient, effective, and empathetic. Not working all night to say that you work all night, but perhaps working all night to get the job done only. And then understanding that they have to rest to let their souls catch up with their body. I paraphrase that from a statement that Patton said many years ago. He says, a leader must rest to let his soul catch up with his body. Understanding that those two components are essential in leadership. You have to have heart. You have to have the drive to do it. And when they are not in sync, you cannot be an effective leader at any given time.
So you, Tony, it's apparent to me that you probably do either a lot of reading or other adjunct activities. What role does that have in your leadership development? Do you believe that reading the leadership accounts of others, has that been helpful to you in terms of developing your own leadership style?
I've read about leaders and read leadership and leadership style all of my life. Here recently, I picked up the book The Secret by Ken Blanchard and Mark Miller. A very insightful book, very short read that gives me some insight to the new aspects of leadership. We talk about servant leadership, these buzzwords that come along the way. I like to say empathetic leadership, and I'm going to try to coin that in a book that I'm writing now. And I had the fortunate opportunity to write a chapter on leadership, what my mother taught me. I actually emphasized my grandmother's leadership training, what my mother taught me, and how I've become an effective leader. It's called MOMS, the 12 Principles of Leadership. So not only do I read, I try to make a contribution to that leadership field, if you will. And I make sure that I maintain this professional development rigor throughout my journey. It's always important to find out what's new, what's old, what can be integrated, and what's just been repackaged. We do a lot of that in the business of business. Someone will come along and say, it's servant leadership. Okay, that's a great term, but didn't we say something different 20 years ago? So being an academic in the discipline of leadership is important as well. Knowing what the trends are, knowing what the failures are, and knowing what things work and what don't work, if you will. It's essentially the same thing.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more, and I think you said it really eloquently. There's some core principles that you need to adhere to. Oftentimes in the business world, we may repackage thematically some of those things and call it a different thing. But if you adhere to those core principles, generally you're in good shape and headed in the right direction. You touched on an important point for me with the mentioning of the word failures. I'm of the belief, as a practicing leader, that we learn infinitely more from our failures than we do from the successes in our leadership. You actually talked about that very snippet, that small story about a different frame of reference that was given to you by one of your senior enlisted soldiers, and it helped you to then frame up how you should approach things in the future. Can you think about one time with maybe a different kind of either failure or shortcoming that's had a lasting impact on you, and like what resonated from that experience? Already sounds like you're a pretty reflective guy, and I'm going to go down the lanes of asking you about how you reflect on your leadership experiences. But what about failures and how you carry them forward?
MK, I smile when you ask that question because I believe I've succeeded by failing and understanding how not to repeat that failure again. A number of times I've attempted to complete a task. An example of a task to be completed, if you will, is developing a training exercise for soldiers that are not infantry soldiers. Infantry soldiers have a certain skill set, they have a certain makeup, they have a certain attitude, and they take risks. I went from the infantry to the transportation corps, where for the first time I worked with, different genders, different makeups, different what we call GT scores. That's the intellectual quotient of a soldier who enters the military. And we literally had some, and I won't say they were smarter soldiers, but they were more innovative and crafty. Setting up a training exercise and watching it absolutely fail because the soldiers that you were training at that time were not equipped to accomplish those missions. A perfect example of understanding failure. I took my truck company out to the field in Germany in 1991. It was an over-the-road truck company that shipped military impedimenta over 2 million miles a year from Amsterdam to the Austrian border. They were essentially CDL truck drivers, the same people that you see in the United States. When I took them to the field, they were fish out of water, if you will. And I was so used to distributing weapons in the weapons room M16s and soldiers being responsible for them. But even my non-commissioned officers weren't as disciplined as I thought they were. I took them out to the field for 7 days, and they were absolutely miserable. It was cold. We were in the dark. I had them dig foxholes and all those things. And I had a distribution system where when a soldier received a real-world mission to ship something, say from a commissary, cold storage goods, from the field location to Amsterdam, instead of just playing in the field like we were doing combat operations, we had an operation where we would receive the soldier's weapon and account for it. Very important item. Guess what? We lost a weapon in the field, but I knew exactly where it was. I knew exactly where it was. It was with the sergeant who did not turn it in correctly. And when we returned from the field after 7 miserable days, in their opinion, I had a great time. Again, I'm a trained airborne ranger, so going to the field was second nature to me, but not to 200 truck drivers.
The audience can't see me smiling and laughing at that statement,
so you can appreciate it because you've been there before, I'm sure. Well, we lost that weapon, but I knew where it was. I made the soldiers go back to the field. I made them go back to the field and look for that weapon for 2 days. It was a miserable operation for them, but it was a training exercise. And I learned that I failed in enforcing that type of discipline prior to going to the field. Another significant event in my military career was taking discipline personally. I learned very quickly never to let a person push your button and make you do things in the heat of passion or anger that could cost you a career. I had a non-commissioned officer who had some substance abuse problems, and he was being difficult. And at my grade, I actually could not reduce him in rank and take his money from him and put him on restriction. I had to refer the case to the first field grade officer, my battalion commander. So this soldier was so out of line. I don't believe in firing soldiers because that's the end of their career. Was so out of line, I hit my highest level of pistivity. And I took the case to the colonel and said, sir, I need him busted. I need his money taken away. And I need him restricted to barracks in Germany. The colonel did everything I requested. So I thought I got that young man. So I was going to make an example of him. So what I had him do is I fired him from my command. And I told my senior non-commissioned officer, my right-hand person, a first sergeant, I said, kick him out of the building, give him his weapon, his NBC suit, give him all his gear, and make him stand outside here in front of this building until the sergeant major can find another location for him to live because he can't live with us anymore. He's fired. I embarrassed that young man. I embarrassed him to the nth degree. I didn't realize it because I thought I was setting an example for the company that you don't screw up without reprisal. I was called in by the colonel who could see that young man standing on the doorstep from his perch in the battalion headquarters on our concern in Mannheim. And he says, Tony, look out there. You got a busted staff sergeant standing up in a formation by himself, waiting to be picked up and moved to another location. He said, Tony, that's embarrassing. You're humiliating him. He said, but more than that, he pushed your button. He made you angry and made you make a bad decision, a bad leadership move that could cost your career. Never expose your button. Never let someone take you to your highest level of pistivity and be so angered that you don't make a conscious decision that's in the best interest for all as a leader. Be responsible.
So you touched on two things there that I want to unpack. One is that immediate response. Oftentimes there are things that happen that you have a visceral response to and oftentimes may generate anger on your part. I think one of the things I've learned over the years is to, when I feel or sense that, is to give it a 24-hour break. In other words, go sit on it for a little bit before I actually respond to it, because I'm much more calm and effective when I've had time to sit on it and not reflect or respond to what my visceral inclination was. So I want to know if that's what you learn from that, or if you're just more tactical about how you go into scenarios where you might get upset about the result or something. So I want to know what you learned from that. And then the other thing that you mentioned was interesting around, you had different levers available to you being an officer in the military. And I want to unpack this topic around the effectiveness of that military style leadership, and maybe how you've seen in your time in the private sector, or actually, I mean, you went from public sector again in a different capacity, but just in a different environment. I mean, you can't tell someone to go stand outside and in your work that you did as the CIO of the state of New York if they made a mistake. But let's go back to that thing about the immediate visceral response, and then I want to talk about the levers available to you in terms of leadership when you think about making sure someone learns the lesson from an event that happens.
What you have to do is take every lesson and work from there. I learned that a visceral response is the last thing you want to do to a soldier. You do not want to respond in anger. So from that point on, I never raised my voice. Even to this day, in a leadership position, I never raised my voice. I always let individuals make mistakes. When it's time for me to take a chill pill, I've learned to walk. I've learned to close the door. I've learned to reflect. And I've learned to seek a higher power. One thing that I always say, that we got 4 things in life. Number 1 is the hand you're dealt, because everybody gets a hand at the table. Number 2 is the way you play that hand. Some people get good cards and lose. Some people get bad cards and win. The third thing is the will of man. And that is that no matter how good you are or how bad you are, there's someone that can lift you up and someone that can take you down deliberately. So it's the hand you dealt, the way you play that hand, the will of man, and I say the grace of God. You have to believe in something bigger than yourself. Now, if you're not a religious person and just a spiritual person, if you're an individual who thinks that you are the greatest person in the world, you have to believe in yourself and be confident and understand that that belief will take you everywhere that you need to go. A long time ago, if you will, I decided that mistakes aren't made if you don't kill somebody or lose $1 million. We can always recover from everything else. So if you go out and wreck a truck's worth $300,000, so what? As long as you're alive. If you don't lose $1 million of equipment, because the Army doesn't pay me $1 million to return that value to them, I can work with you. Let people recover from mistakes. When you make a mistake, be patient. When someone makes a mistake, walk away. Walk away, take a chill pill, and learn how to vent your frustration. That's what you have to do, because we're going to get angry. Every day is not going to be sunny, nor is every day going to be rainy. Learn to balance it and learn to recognize the two.
Yeah, I love the tools that you identified, and it sounds like you actually codified them in a way that's personal to you. But the big takeaway there for anyone listening is really around those visceral reactions that you have. It's worth extricating yourself from the environment, the scenario, thinking on it a bit, calming down, and having a much more calm approach in terms of what your response is going to be. What about the second part that I teed up? I certainly, as someone who spent an extensive career in public service as well, and now I'm in the technical sector, and the levers that you have specifically in the military are fairly unique in terms of leadership. There's really no other environment in terms of being a leadership factory where you have those types of like complete control levers available to you. What was that transition like for you going into civilian public sector work? You were probably so polished by the time you got there that maybe you the approach or transition wasn't difficult, but maybe of and can think about many veterans have trouble transitioning from the lifestyle, the leadership style, sort of the components that they have available in their life as active duty soldiers, Marines, sailors, and airmen, have trouble translating that into the civilian world. What was that transition like for you? And are there things that you now take away as you're spending at least a little bit of time in retirement before you get that next phone call, I'm sure? How do you think about the difference in leadership in those two environments?
I tell young people all the time, initially you develop a mantra. As a young leader in the military, I always said training, maintaining, sustaining leadership, discipline, and safety. Those were the things that I focused on as a tactical leader. Those are the things that were important to me. Are my people trained? Can we sustain? Is my equipment maintained? Am I developing my leaders? Are my soldiers disciplined? And are they safe at all times? When I left active duty and became a civilian at the highest level of state government and the governor's cabinet, I boiled that down to 4 Ps: people, processes, products or technologies that we're going to use, and then policy. Understanding the aspect of people, that people have to be developed, people have to be cared for, people have to be trained, and people have to be supported. People have problems, people have aspirations, people have failures. Understanding that empathetic leadership quotient when it comes to people, not just from an operational perspective, because they're going to do the job if you train them. They're going to do the job if you feed them. They're going to do the job if they're driven, if you motivate them. But that squishy stuff in the middle. And then understanding from a leadership perspective that as opposed to absolute power in the military, which is a misnomer, that power doesn't exist as a civilian, you have to codify your operations. Be consistent, have a process, always work on process improvement. That's the codification, if you will, of those militaristic things that are functional, that are programmable, those things that are by the book, if you will. Understand how to identify a process, repeat that process, improve that process, and eventually make that process more efficient. No matter what the process is, institute that same type of discipline, that same type of value in your number 1 P, your people. Being able to identify what works for you, the tools that help you do your job are those products, be it technology, be it scientific tools, be it mechanical tools, those things that help you do your job, being able to lean forward and have a predictive analysis approach to what is going to be the latest and greatest. How can my people use these tools to be more efficient, more effective, and develop a great product or service? And then finally, policy. We talk discipline in the military. We exercise discipline in the military, but all we're actually doing is adhering to policy. Understanding the impact of policy when it comes to leadership, following the rules. Is it moral? Is it legal? Is it ethical? These are the things that have translated from my training, maintaining leadership, discipline, and safety mantra to my people, processes, products, which are technology in my field, and then policy, following the guidelines, making sure people follow the guidelines. So it was an easy transition for me. Again, I never thought that power was absolute in the military. I learned early not to be a dictator, an autocrat, not to be a heathen, not to be a Hitler, to be compassionate with my people. So I learned to talk to them. So transitioning to the civilian role was a lot easier for me because I didn't have an ego. I've seen failures. I worked from failures. I thrive from failures. Now it was about successes because they look at success differently in the civilian world.
Outstanding. Hey, as you continue to evolve as a leader, given these 3 choices, how do you view yourself in your sweet spot? Like, what's the best for you? Coach, direct leader, or adjacent advisor? What's the sweet spot for you?
I would say direct leader. I like to stand in front and take charge. It's part of my DNA. It's a part of my makeup. It's a part of my ego, quite frankly. I like giving direction and seeing that direction follow, and then being able to improve on that direction, if you will. Understanding that I'm never the smartest person in the room, leveraging that smart person and making that person humble, and then making sure that person understands that if they think they're the smartest person in the one and their value in the room and their value is equivalent to 1, and then looking at everybody else in the room as a 0, I tell that person that you should be a force multiplier, and 1 times 0 is 0. So being the smartest person in the room is not an effective leadership style, and you add no value to my operation. Be a team member.
I think we could probably use some of that in the tech realm. Love it. Hey, so a little bit of a quip. In the military, we had statements like, "Who's the best pilot you ever saw?" The stick jockeys, and I like to equate that to the leadership realm. And you can certainly name yourself if you think that's appropriate. But who's the best leader you ever saw, and what about how it was that they did their job really resonated with you, something that you saw and you were just like, I am going to act in that way or carry that with me moving forward?
I can call these names verbatim. Captain Stephen Foster, my first rifle company commander in an infantry company. He walked the part, he looked the part, he was the part of leader. He would be in early and stay late. If we had a forced march of 20 miles, he would be up front. He would be very candid, very articulate, very deliberate, very compassionate as a leader, very forceful. He commanded respect. He didn't make people respect him. He commanded respect. When he walked in the room, he had presence. Now, in the middle, I said two, but there are actually three. I have a friend who's passed away, a fraternity brother, Michael Jackson. Michael Jackson gave me the understanding of presence and being forceful enough and dynamic enough to stop the room when he walked in the room. He looked the part, he spoke the part, he was the part, and he was always correct, or he stood to be corrected when he was incorrect. He was never so egotistical that he could not be corrected or advised. The last was my senior leader in Iraq, Lieutenant General Robert Kazan. I'm sure you're familiar with him, MK. He was the superintendent of West Point when he left Iraq, leading the Office of Security Cooperation in Iraq, OSCI, Iraq. General Kazan was a hands-off leader. He gave you the mission, and he stood back and watched you get it done. He was there to support you. He was there to give advice. He was not there to lead you by the nose. He gave complete control to his subordinate leaders. During the downsizing of Iraq, during the initial drawdown in 2012, we left open 6 bases. I can't remember them verbatim. I do remember the one that I commanded in Kirkuk. And we were the only base to take sustained indirect fire for 14 months after the soldiers left. We were attacked over 383 times with indirect fire, various occasions, various times for various reasons. But he let me run the show. He gave me all of the support I needed. He provided the logistics I needed. And he provided that mentoring, that coaching, and that guidance when I was confused. He was an infantry officer. I was an infantry officer 30 years before that. He was still in the infantry. I had done transportation and information systems at that time, but together we worked, and he was just a great leader.
You sound like you got enough in you for a book. When are you going to write your leadership book?
I'm actually on chapter 4 now.
Outstanding.
I'm on chapter 4 now, and it's about leadership.
Awesome. So we would love to, if you're willing, have you back after you finish and publish that book. I'm sure there will be some additional lessons, and I'm hoping that the audience took away some nuggets from this conversation. And I think, the big takeaway for me is the ability to adapt and learn over time in terms of what you take away from the experiences that you've had. And I love that you have the different aspects of your leadership experience codified, which is why I will be a fan of any book that you eventually write and publish. But Tony, it's been a pleasure having this quick conversation with you. Love some aspects of your background, and we will continue, I think, on the debate as to whether or not leaders are born or made, but I like the firm stand that you took. So we'll probably go back and forth on that and the guests that we interview over this period of time. But love the stance you take. I appreciate having you in, and thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, MK. I look forward to working with you in the future. And if any time you need me, give me a call. Let's talk. Let's talk about why I think leaders are born and not made.
All right, Tony. Tony Riddick, former CIO for the state of New York, retired Colonel, United States Army. It's a pleasure having you in the studio, and we'll see you guys on the next session of The Leadership Student.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of The Leadership Student Podcast with MK Palmore, part of the ITSP Magazine Podcast Network. If you learned something new and this conversation made you think, then add this show to your favorite podcast player, subscribe to the ITSP Magazine YouTube channel, and share the ITSP Magazine Podcast Network with your friends, family, and colleagues. If you represent a company and wish to connect your brand to our conversations and our audience, visit itspmagazine.com to learn how to sponsor one or more of our podcast channels. We hope you will come back for more stories and follow us on our journey.